But if we're going to trust the science, the scientists themselves must be trustworthy. Consider the implications of what they've not investigated. Ideas that were once held to be absolute facts are overturned and put in the dustbin of history. A structure can express ancient ideas without necessarily being ancient itself. We have to have respect for all of those traditions. No, it's not just astrology. It's the result of thousands of years of precise scientific observations. The notion that we represent the apex and the pinnacle of what advancement can be is just rubbish. We know that shamans, going back to the origins of humanity, have embraced those realms and called them spirit worlds, become disconnected from spirit. And yet spirit is a fundamental part of the human experience. It's like chopping off our left arms and suddenly saying, oh, that's okay. Or we can move this thing I'm sitting on.
I appreciate you helping out my shot.
You're going to pull this one. That's much better.
Okay, we ready?
Yep.
All right. Graham Hancock.
Hi, Sam.
Welcome to New England from Old England.
Yes, it's good to be in New England again, and it's a great pleasure to meet you. I really appreciate and value your work. I think you're doing an important job with your channel, and I think your channel deserves a great deal of success.
That that would mean a lot coming from anybody, but coming from you, it does mean the world. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I want to start out with a soft question, I guess. You were born in Edinburgh.
I was born in Edinburgh, in Scotland, in 1950, which is a tremendously long time ago.
Right.
And I suppose if I think of myself as anything, it's as a Scot. My mother was Scottish, my father was English, and they met in Edinburgh.
Okay.
And I was born there. I did have and still do have a strong identification with Scotland's liberation struggles against England,
right?
And the mood of rebellion that Scotland represents.
Absolutely,
has somehow inserted itself into my genes.
Right, and then your father is English, but Cornish.
Well, yes, I've done some sort of digging into this. The name Hancock, I had thought it was a Welsh name because my father's father, my grandfather, was Welsh, we all thought. But it turns out that his family, a generation before, had moved to Wales from Cornwall.
Right.
And actually, the Hancock name is from Cornwall.
Right.
They had been tin miners in Cornwall, and what attracted them to Wales was coal mining job opportunities. So they joined the mining community in South Wales.
So that's interesting because I had always thought, I was just thinking you're English, but you're really mostly Celtic in a lot of ways.
I guess so.
Yeah, which is great. I wasn't even going to bring it up, but my family is quite Irish. My mother's 100%. I'll say her name, but I'll bleep it out for the thing. But my mother's name is
right. Yes.
So I'm heavily invested.
There's still a strong feeling about these matters. I did live in Northern Ireland for some years.
You did. Wow.
Just before the Troubles began. Of course, Northern Ireland, the whole of Ireland, was a British colony at one time.
Right.
And the IRA has been given a bad name, but fundamentally it was a liberation struggle.
Right.
Which worked.
Yes. And it did. And yeah, that's a whole. We could fill a whole podcast episode about that. But we have a lot of things
we do
to talk about. So one of the first things, I think that we have a common thread here. You were speaking to somebody. I think it was D. Dunking. And you were talking about the issues with, these are my words, but, archaeologists believing they have a monopoly on that's something I think about a lot. That's something I talk about a lot. And that's essentially the point of the name illegitimate scholar. It's not just archaeology, but with academia in general.
It's across a whole range of disciplines. There are some disciplines which rightly do have a kind of monopoly on their subject matter. I'm thinking of the sort of extreme edge of physics. For that matter, flying an airplane, you do want your pilot to absolutely know what he's doing and to trust that pilot to do the right thing. And that's a very specialized, very focused skill on one particular skill set. But I think archaeology doesn't fall into the category either of quantum physics or of flying an the archaeology is always a work in progress. The the next turn of the archaeologist's spade can completely change the story if they admit that the story needs to be changed. And most of what it's about is interpretation of scarce data. And that is not what flying an airplane is about. It's about knowing your skills and being able to deliver them. In the case of interpretation, I think that all of us have a right to offer interpretations of the past. And it's wrong for archaeologists to claim that they are the experts and that nobody else is really allowed to speak about it. It's one of the criticisms that's thrown at me a lot, and also thrown at others of us who aren't archaeologists, but nevertheless are operating in the general field area in which archaeology operates. And again, they throw their qualifications at us and say, we are the ones who are qualified to speak about this. And it's almost, how dare you speak about this? But there's a double standard, because if a non-archaeologist speaks about archaeological matters in a way that archaeologists approve of, they'll be very happy with that. But if a non-archaeologist speaks about archaeology in a way that archaeologists don't approve of, all hell gets let loose sometimes. And so I do feel that we're looking at a group of scholars who have an overblown idea of their own importance, an overblown idea of the importance of their own work, and who are claiming control of the narrative about the past. And this can't be good, because the past of humanity is our universal heritage. All of us here on planet Earth, all of us human beings, the past matters to us. And it can't be right to entrust the interpretation of our collective past to a very small group of scholars who certainly do some excellent work. And their work
that you cite quite often.
I'd like to be clear about that. I have a lot of respect for archaeologists, and they're doing a great deal of important work, and a lot of it I rely upon. The problem is when they claim a monopoly. This should not be the case. There should not be a monopoly in this field. There should be openness to other points of view and other perspectives. And it's through those other points of view and other perspectives that archaeology may have the opportunity to grow. I still don't understand to this day why archaeologists are so defensive about their field and why they're so hostile about alternative point of view. Even if an alternative point of view is 99% wrong, there may be 1% of it in it which is valuable, which is useful. And I don't find the destructive method that is used in archaeology helpful. I think it's much better to look at alternative ideas, and rather than setting out to destroy them, to damage the credibility of those who are expressing those ideas, it would be more healthy and more useful for the future if archaeologists would actually look for what's good in those ideas, see what may be valuable. Then there could be some kind of cooperation instead of this constant conflict between alternative and mainstream. I've met archaeologists who don't like the word mainstream archaeologists. They just say archaeology. There's no such thing as mainstream archaeology. We are archaeologists, it's an infuriating attitude, and I've come across it more and more over the last 30 plus years. Particularly as my work has got more prominent, it has attracted the attention of archaeologists. And I think, perhaps I'm guessing, but I think what they feel threatened by is that the alternative points of view that I'm expressing are reaching large numbers of people. They didn't bother when my ideas were reaching small numbers of people, but as the numbers grew and grew, then their need to control the narrative came forward. And their method of controlling the narrative, by and large, has been ad hominem attacks on me, an attempt to defame me, to slur me, to smear me. And in so doing, I suspect they hope that the public will take what they say as true and will just ignore my work and the work of others working on the alternative side of the past.
Yeah. What strikes me so much about this is that there are certain members who are willing to lie, or in certain cases lie, in certain cases distort the truth or say untrue statements in the pursuit of convincing people that their narrative is the correct one. And that seems counterintuitive to me, that it's not going to work, especially in the type of technology that we have today, where it can be checked. It can be verified. It can absolutely be.
It's very short-sighted strategy, but it comes from the motivation behind it is to win at all costs, to destroy the opposition at all costs. It's almost like political parties in a way, or one political party, because nobody that I know of on the alternative side, and certainly not me, seek to destroy archaeology. We value and respect archaeology, and we get a huge amount of important information from archaeology. Our project, my project, certainly speaking for myself, is not to destroy archaeology. I would hope that my work attracts more people to be interested in archaeology. But if your motive is to destroy an alternative point of view, then of course you will use anything that works for that in the moment. And unfortunately, some archaeologists do that.
Right. Some. But you have also, like, even in season 1, and this was, it seems to have been ignored. I mean, you have archaeologists on the show.
Yeah.
You reference archaeological data. You've even asked for archaeologists to do certain work and said that you hope that they do, which, if they're trying to pursue a narrative that you are wanting to hide, you're wanting to not have, like, you're trying to lie to people, that you're trying to convince them of something that isn't true, then why would you want them to be looking more? It doesn't make any sense.
It's an ironic situation, and the problem is that I would welcome more archaeologists on the shows that I do, and I would welcome access to more archaeological sites. But between season 1 and season 2, we have found that archaeological sites in America, because season 2 is largely about America, that archaeological sites have been closed to us because archaeologists claim that I'm somehow their enemy and that I'm doing harm and that I'm practicing what they call pseudo-archaeology, which is another one of these weaponized terms.
Right. It's not a word that's in the dictionary, to be clear. It's a term that archaeologists use.
It's a term that archaeologists use. They circle the wagons around one another, and their first reaction is to keep me out of sites where I might film. So, for example, this happened in season 1 with Serpent Mound. We were able to use drones, and we were able to film from neighboring land, but we were denied access to Serpent Mound in Ohio, and we were denied. They made a mistake in doing it in writing. Right. They denied access in writing, and they said in writing that we were being denied access because I was presenting the series.
Yes.
Other people presenting a series would be given access, but we were denied access because Graham Hancock was presenting the series. To me, that's just the most brutal, basic, and actually stupid form of censorship that can possibly be practiced. And in season 2, we would love to have filmed at Cahokia in Illinois, a site that I know very well, that I've visited many times before, that is a huge credit to Native American intelligence, industry, and inventiveness. And we were denied access to Cahokia. I wanted very much to film at Moundville in Alabama. It's an important part of my story. There's certain mythology there which is extremely interesting and which has very close parallels with, for example, ancient Egyptian mythology. Those parallels are a fact. The interpretation that may be put on them can be quite different between archaeologists and me, but the parallels are there. So we were denied access to Moundville in Alabama as well, and other sites also. It seemed to be a sort of closing of the ranks. Keep Graham Hancock out by any means, and if he can be kept out, maybe he won't be able to tell his story, and that alternative narrative will not reach large numbers of people. As I say, it's a stupid strategy on the part of archaeology to do that, or even to imagine that would work. Right. Far better if there's an alternative point of view, to welcome that person in and to make sure that the archaeological point of view is put across as well, you know, rather than just shutting down and making it almost impossible. I would have thought that the management of the Cahokia site would have been very pleased to see tens of millions of people all over the world seeing the beauty and majesty and the sheer cleverness and brilliance of that site and the ideas that site incorporates. But instead, no, you can't film here.
And I've been there as well, and it is beautiful. It's
a wonderful
incredible.
place, yeah.
It's absolutely incredible. I've stood on top and of the not Monk's Mound. Is that what it's called? One of the larger ones.
Yeah.
I love Cahokia. There's a big difference, I think, between the Ohio site, which was private, and I think Cahokia and Moundville, which are both public.
Yeah.
I understand you're not an American citizen, but at the same time,
even the Ohio site is not really private. It's not privately owned. It's in the public domain. It's run by an outfit called the Ohio History Connection.
Oh. Right,
but
they're not private entirely.
No, it's not a private site. And if it is, there'd be something very wrong with that. I get it in the case of in the case of the Hopewell earthworks. Part of that is in a golf course, which has owned that land, that particular bit of land with earthworks in it privately for decades. Mm-hmm. And although that sounds horrible, actually, in a way, the fact that there's a golf course there has meant that the mounds have been preserved in a way that they might not have been.
Many of the mounds, a lot of people listening will know, were destroyed in the creation of St. Louis.
Hundreds of thousands were destroyed.
Yeah, a lot of them.
In order to get access to that site, you don't just need the permission of the Moundville Country Club or whatever they call themselves. Mm-hmm. You not Moundville. I forgot the Newark Country Club. I can't remember the name,
Ohio
but
one.
you don't just need their permission. You need the permission of the Ohio History Connection as well. Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of stranglehold that archaeologists have on the past, which they are choosing to exercise. In my case, in a very unseemly manner. Behaving like dictators in countries where there's no freedom of expression at all. America is supposed to be the homeland of free speech.
Supposed to be.
And should welcome free speech, even if that free speech is disagreed with. In fact, that is the definition of free speech, that free speech allows others who have a different point of view from yours to say what they wish. Mm-hmm. And that should be the case, but it's not the case. And it's ironic that that's happening in America. It happens elsewhere too.
Right.
It happens elsewhere too, but there's a particularly forceful body of archaeologists in America called the Society for American Archaeology. Yes, some of the members have been gunning for me for years, and they wrote this open letter to Netflix back in 2022 when season 1 was released. Effectively seeking to get the series cancelled.
Yeah.
They dressed it up in fancy language so they didn't have to take responsibility for actually seeking to get it cancelled, but what they suggested instead was that this documentary series, that Netflix should reclassify it as science fiction, which effectively is cancelling the series. It's a documentary series classified as science fiction. Nobody's going to watch it.
Right.
And that was the trick that they pulled in that letter. But of course, it didn't work. Fortunately, it didn't work. No matter how high and mighty the Society for American Archaeology may imagine itself to be, it cannot exercise that level of power over others, but it tries to do so.
Right.
The very fact that it tried to do so discredits it, in my view.
I agree, and I think that if you, it speaks to the mindset of what you're saying. It's evidence towards them having this mindset, because if they don't agree with what you have to say and they have evidence against what you have to say, then they would just share that evidence and they would. You know, I watched the documentary that was about flat earthers, and they covered flat earthers, and they let them do whatever they wanted, doing different scientific tests, very advanced scientific tests. Yeah. And they just showed it, and they showed them doing their own scientific tests and proving themselves wrong and then making a justification afterwards. Yeah. And if your ideas were in any way similar to that, you'd think that they would want to fight against it by arguing against your points and being honest about what your points are, but that's not what we see. We see censorship.
We see censorship. We see smear campaigns. We see organized ridicule. We see bots repeating the same comments on social media posts in virtually the same language. When you check the account that it comes from, it's an account that has 0 followers and 0 videos, again and again and again. There is an organized campaign on the part of archaeologists to control the narrative about the past, and it's not just directed at me; it's directed at everybody who's offering an alternative point of view on the past. And this cannot hold. It should not last. It has to change. And I hope by reaching a large number of people, that I've done a little bit to begin to break that stranglehold that archaeology has on the past, and to allow people access to a coherently argued, thoroughly worked out alternative point of view.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things is that they assert that you have no evidence, and a certain individual twisted your words in that you were saying that there is no evidence, which is not what you said.
I've addressed that individual in a video that I've put out on my YouTube channel. Mm-hmm. It's called Fact Checking Flint Dibble. Flint Dibble is the individual who I had a debate with on the Joe Rogan Experience back in April 2024. And at the time, I took him completely at face value. But when I had sufficient time to actually do some fact checking, I couldn't do it live on the show.
Of course.
And I was very busy completing season 2 of Ancient Apocalypse, so I couldn't do it immediately afterwards either. But some months later, I was able to do it. And I found a number of very serious problems in what he'd been saying. So I've set those out in a 1-hour video, and that's really the most that I have to say on this subject. If people want to know my views about that particular debate, mm-hmm. I'm not claiming that fact checking Flint Dibble's statements proves that I was right. Not at all. What I'm saying is, have a look at this and see what it tells you about how some people who call themselves scientists manipulate information in order to win a point and destroy an opponent. Right. And this, to me, is a bigger problem than just archaeology. It's a problem right across the board in the world today. We are constantly asked to trust the science. But if we're going to trust the science, the scientists themselves must be trustworthy. It's not enough to say, I'm a scientist, I have a PhD, I've done these excavations. They must act and behave and speak in a trustworthy manner. And I think that's the main reason that I made that video, not to say that I won anything. I actually don't care whether I won or not. I was there to try to have a respectable dialogue about the past with an archaeologist, and in retrospect, that's not what it turned out to be.
Right, and that's what I was hoping it would be, and it was not. I'd also like to point out that archaeology is a proper noun, right? Archaeology is a proper noun made by humans who have their own methods. They have their own ways of doing things that are imperfect. There mm-hmm. are pros and cons, just like there are pros and cons on the alternative side, which is much more broad.
Yeah.
So when there's talk of no archaeological evidence, what that means is there's no evidence that archaeology as a proper field, which is practiced in different areas.
That particular quotation, which is snipped out of a longer statement that I made on the Joe Rogan Experience, has been repeatedly used, and I do draw attention to this in my fact-checking Flint Dibble video. Mm-hmm. That particular statement was, I did not say I have no evidence for my lost civilization. What I said was, in what you've found, right. I have no evidence. And that's a very different matter.
But can we say there's no evidence for an advanced civilization in what they have studied?
In what they have studied, yes, we can say there's no evidence for an advanced civilization. But that brings us to another issue of what is studied and what is not studied by archaeology, which we can get into, and we will get into. Because when I look at Göbekli Tepe, for example, sure, I'm interested in all the archaeology that's been done there. But I'm focusing on things that archaeologists don't focus on. I'm not what they've studied, but things they haven't studied, and things that they even reject. For example, the shifting alignments to the rising point of the star Sirius over a period of time at Göbekli Tepe. That's the kind of thing that interests me. The symbolism of those huge pillars mm-hmm. with the hands folded across the belly in that way. These are issues that archaeologists don't study. When it comes to the Great Sphinx of Giza, yes, archaeologists have studied the Sphinx, but I don't find archaeological studies very helpful with regard to the Sphinx. I'm much more interested in the geology of the Sphinx, mm-hmm. which speaks potentially to its much greater antiquity because of the weathering patterns in the trench around the Sphinx and on the body of the Sphinx itself. And I'm very interested in the astronomy of the Sphinx and the symbolism of the Sphinx as a lion-bodied monument that faces the rising sun on the spring equinox. In other words, it's oriented perfectly due east.
Right.
And I don't think it's a coincidence that the constellation of Leo was the constellation that housed the sun on the spring equinox 12,500 years ago. I think there's a deliberate connection being made here. Now, of course, archaeologists reject all that completely, and they're welcome to do so. And they would say, no, those constellations, that a constellation like Leo wasn't recognized by anybody until the Babylonians or even the Greeks
that we know of.
However, there's a compelling evidence, even from the painted caves like Lascaux in France, that the constellations, as we recognize them today, were recognized in that form in deep antiquity. So I'm going off in a different direction from archaeologists. And in what archaeologists study, what they have presented to the public, no, there's no evidence for a lost civilization. That's why I'm here. I'm here to look at what they've not studied. I'm here to consider the implications of what they've not investigated, of what they've not said. And that's what was cut out. So I wasn't saying there's no evidence. I'd be pretty crazy to say there's no evidence when I spent the last 30 years writing a series of enormous books running to thousands of pages with thousands of footnotes to stand at the end of that and say there was no evidence. But again, it's a sign of a tactic that's being used to take a clip out of context and then kind of use that to say Hancock says he has no evidence for his lost civilization. Well, no, I have masses of evidence. It's just not the evidence that archaeologists study or that archaeologists like.
Right. And to me, the astronomical alignments that you bring up at many sites, they're precise and they're very convincing to me.
They're very precise, and it's a worldwide phenomenon. Another thing I think that archaeologists don't get about my position, because they keep claiming that or saying that I claim that certain monuments, let's take Cahokia for example, or Poverty Point in Louisiana, which we did cover in season 1, or the monuments of the Giza Plateau, that I'm saying that those were all built 12,500 years ago. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that what we find manifested again and again in sites all around the world, which are separated by thousands of miles and in some cases by thousands of years, are the same ideas coming up and manifesting and expressing themselves and leading to the shape and structure of those sites. It's the ideas that are ancient, not necessarily the site itself. And in a way, what I'm doing is something, again, that archaeologists don't do, which is an archaeology of ideas. And when you find, for example, the same notion of the journey of the soul after death in Moundville in Alabama, and you find it in ancient Egypt, a leap to the sky, specifically to the constellation of Orion, cross over to the Milky Way, make a journey along the Milky Way, confront all sorts of challenges and ordeals on that journey where you must account for the life you've lived. These are two complicated ideas to have just randomly arisen in two totally separate cultures. And the best explanation I can find for that is that both have shared a legacy from a much older culture that we've lost track of. It's that legacy of ideas that I'm exploring all around the world. And it manifests in myths, it manifests in symbolism, and it manifests in astronomical alignments very, very, very strongly. Mm-hmm. I do think that some ancient sites do date back 12,500 years. I think the Sphinx is at least 12,500 years old. That is supported not only by the astronomical alignment, but also by the geology. I think the gigantic megalithic temples next to the Sphinx, one is called the Valley Temple, it's still in relatively good condition, and one is called the Sphinx Temple, which is pretty much destroyed, are part of a megalithic legacy on the Giza Plateau, which do date back 12,000 years. It's interesting that the ancient Egyptians modified, repaired, restored the Valley Temple that's next to the Sphinx. They took the original limestone blocks, which in some cases weigh up to 100 tons each, true megaliths, which had been very weathered and eroded by the time of the pharaohs. And what they did was they then put granite facing stones on those ancient limestone blocks, but respected the original limestone blocks so much that they cut the granite on the inside so that it could fit perfectly into the erosion patterns. So what they were doing, in my view, was restoring a very ancient monument. They were not responsible for the limestone blocks. They were responsible for the granite that was added later. And this has led to a confusion, I think, on the part of Egyptologists who just attribute the whole thing to the Fourth Dynasty without really considering the geological implications of the way that that temple is constructed. And also, there is not a single inscription on that temple that says it was built by the pharaoh who Egyptologists attribute it to, which is the pharaoh Khafre of the Fourth Dynasty. There are inscriptions on the temple, on the granite, but those inscriptions don't refer to any particular pharaoh. They just say beloved of Bastet. They don't give the full details. So I think the evidence connecting the Sphinx and its neighboring temples to the Fourth Dynasty is quite flimsy. The Fourth Dynasty was definitely involved in restoring and rehabilitating those sites, but I don't think it originally created those sites. And this is the case in a number of other places around the world, but particularly strong at Giza.
And there's this is something we see a lot in ancient history, as well as even more modern history, is that sites of spiritual importance are revered throughout, beyond cultural continuity. You have the mosque in Istanbul, which used to be an Orthodox church. You have the Temple Mount in Israel.
Sacred sites stay sacred,
right?
And they take on the latest, the character of the latest civilization that is around them. But they're still there.
Yes,
they're very ancient sacred places. It's important to say, in the case of the Sphinx, there is no written evidence that connects the Sphinx to Khafre either.
Right.
This is, again, something that Egyptologists claim as a fact, that the Sphinx was the work of Khafre in the Fourth Dynasty. But there's no written evidence for that.
Is that just association with the pyramid, essentially?
The stela between the paws of the Sphinx was erected more than 1,000 years after the date that Egyptologists believe the Sphinx was built, and it dates to the time of Thutmose. It records a dream that he had in the shadow of the body of the Sphinx when the Sphinx was largely covered with sand. And the dream told him to renovate and restore the Sphinx, to remove the sand from around the Sphinx. But the name Khafre did appear on that stela. It's not there anymore. And it wasn't even the full name Khafre. There was just Khaf, Kaf, appeared on that stela in a broken line without the normal royal cartouche that surrounds a king's name. So to deduce from the fact that a non-contemporary stela bears a name that might be the name of Khafre does not tell us that Khafre built the Sphinx. Because the lines are missing, that stela could equally well be telling us that Khafre restored the Sphinx. This, again, is a conclusion that Egyptologists come to, which is not justified by the evidence. And there is another stela on the Giza Plateau, the inventory stela, which says that the Sphinx was already there during the reign of Khufu. Khufu, Khafre's predecessor. Egyptologists ignore that stela completely.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't even know that.
It's called the inventory stela, and because they don't like it, they try to pretend that it was some sort of late forgery.
Right, and that's what interpretation allows you to do if you're in a field, and then it just stands on your interpretation.
Yeah, and it's why alternative interpretations are necessary, because most of the public, again, archaeologists object to the fact that I have a large platform in Netflix. But I think it's important to remind them that they have an even larger platform, which is the education system. All the teaching that we get from childhood right through the university system about the past, should we get any teaching about the past at all, particularly the remote past, is based on the findings of archaeology, without question. They're not debated or discussed at all. And that gives archaeology a strong hold over the public notion of the past, much stronger than a TV show, a stronghold that has been there from the beginning of a person's life, really. Almost take it in with their mother's milk, that this is how things were. And when we find there are so many flaws in the archaeological interpretations, it's really vital that there's an alternative point of view.
Right.
And Flint Dibble, in an unwise tweet, did actually say that. He said, Graham Hancock's Netflix flow doesn't have anything like the outreach that we have.
Right.
And of course, he put the words "big archaeology" in scare quotes, but
Right.
but actually, I think those words were quite appropriate, because big archaeology is behaving to restrict and censor alternative points of view. I don't think it's a conspiracy. I don't think archaeologists are sitting down in dark corners and making plans to damage me or to damage others in this field. I think most of them honestly believe that their point of view is right.
Right.
And they so passionately believe it's right that they're prepared to use any tactics to oblige the public to believe what they believe.
Right. And I've done some, for multiple different videos, I've done cuts of you saying over and over again at separate points that you don't believe there's a conspiracy against you. And I just did a video where I went over one of Flint's threads against you, and he was, you didn't say a lot of the things that he claimed that he said.
It's most unfortunate.
Yeah.
It's most unfortunate. And I don't understand why an alternative view of prehistory is a conspiracy anyway, because they call me, they say that I claim that they're in conspiracy against me, which I don't. I don't think there's an archaeological conspiracy.
So I don't know if you know this, but by training, I'm a social studies teacher.
Right.
Right. Secondary school social studies teacher. I never actually got a job in it, but I got my degrees in. I went a little overboard. I was on the GI Bill from the U.S. military, and I got degrees in a double BA in history and history and anthropology, and then a BS in educational curriculum, as well as getting certified to teach social studies. And that's, you were speaking about this a moment ago. This is huge, the textbook issue.
Yeah.
Textbooks are created by a very small number of companies.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult, especially before high school, and even in high school, in a lot of standard, like not AP, which in the U.S. is like, these are like college level courses you take in high school, and lower level and honors classes, which are the highest level if you're not an AP yet. Unless you're in those classes, and even in those classes, mostly you're just reading the information from the textbook as fact. And most of the time, when you're actually reading the sources themselves, I spend a lot of time reading scientific papers, mostly anthropology. Either cultural anthropology or archaeology. They're generally not as they're not saying these things 100% most of the time, at least in a single paper. The academics themselves, in most cases, when they're doing that, they're speaking a lot more conservatively. But by the time it reaches the textbook, it is reported as fact.
Yeah. What was a speculation or a hypothesis magically transforms itself into a fact.
Right.
This happens again and again, and then that fact bolstered by the qualifications of the archaeologists themselves. They rely on that. We are archaeologists. We have our PhDs. What we're saying is true, and what they're saying again and again is actually speculation and is often overturned. The history of science shows that archaeological notions of the past do shift. They are very reluctant to shift, but they do. They do shift, and ideas that were once held to be absolute facts are overturned and put in the dustbin of history.
Right.
This happens again and again. So I think it would be smart for archaeologists to be open to the notion that that can happen again in the future.
I mean, not to beat a dead horse, but it's a great example. When we're talking about a possible paradigm shift in archaeology, we're talking about a paradigm shift that shifts the paradigm away from the existing paradigm, which has only been in place as far as North America is concerned for 30 years.
Yeah.
Like it's one lifetime, not even, that there are still PhDs today that were PhDs when Clovis first was dogma.
Yeah.
So I don't.
Clovis first being the notion that the first humans who entered the Americas did so around 13,400 years ago, that they did so by a specific route, crossing the Bering Land Bridge, which are now the Bering Straits. Sea levels were lower during the Ice Age. There was a land bridge there.
Right.
It made sense as a route that people would enter the Americas from Siberia. And there was a culture that archaeologists call the Clovis culture. We have no idea what they called themselves.
Right.
And for a very long time, it was the view of archaeology that they were the first inhabitants, first human inhabitants of the Americas, and that nobody had come before. And that idea clung on like grim death against more and more refuting evidence, which showed that people had been in the Americas much longer than that. But it's taken decades to get rid of that dogma and to begin to recognize that there is evidence for a much earlier human presence in the Americas. And that's why we began episode 1 of season 2 of Ancient Apocalypse with the human footprints at White Sands in New Mexico.
Right. That was a really touching scene, by the way, one of my favorites.
We've come to see where our ancestor once walked this earth. And to place my hands in the little footprints of children. You know, and it gets very emotional.
Yeah, it was touching for me too. White Sands is an amazing place, and Kim Charlie, who the Native American lady who I worked with there, just recognizes the importance of these footprints for her people and their presence on the land for so much longer than had previously been recognized, but I chose those footprints because they're one of the few areas where there's now almost no dispute. I'm not saying there is no dispute at all, because every new idea in archaeology is attacked. But nevertheless, the evidence that those footprints are 23,000 years old is almost universally accepted now, and which of course completely blows Clovis first out of the water by 10,000 years. But it's important to know that there are many other sites in North America and in South America, which show evidence of human presence much earlier than 23,000 years ago. The one that I think is particularly important was originally published in Nature magazine, thoroughly peer-reviewed, thoroughly documented.
Right. Nature magazine, the known rag, no credibility on that at all, of course.
Yeah, a thoroughly peer-reviewed article.
If you don't know,
a thoroughly peer-reviewed article published in Nature about what's called the Cerruti Mastodon site. The Cerruti Mastodon site is just south of San Diego in California, and the objects that were excavated there are now on display in the San Diego Natural History Museum. And what they found was evidence that human beings had killed and butchered a mastodon and had used tools to extract the marrow from the bones. And that this happened 130,000 years ago. Not 13,000 years ago, not 23,000 years ago, but 130,000 years ago, before there were any anatomically modern humans in Europe. This is an extremely ancient finding, and naturally, despite its impeccable credentials, despite the peer review that it went through, despite the absolute solid reputations of the team behind it, led by Tom Desmarais, other archaeologists have sought to tear this down and to bring it down and to attack it in every way possible and say, no, this can't be right. The bones were just broken by some bulldozer.
Oh, no, you can tell. They know that they can tell.
Yeah. So you know, again, the point is clear. It's not just people who are taking an alternative view of prehistory who are getting attacked by the archaeological mainstream. It's archaeologists themselves who are being attacked if they bring forward evidence that contradicts a prevailing paradigm. And right now, that prevailing paradigm, even with White Sands, is that the Americas were settled by humans relatively recently. And that flies in the face of an enormous amount of evidence from all across the Americas, north, south, and central. And the Cerruti Mastodon site is an excellent example of that and needs to be taken much more seriously. Because if human beings were in the Americas 130,000 years ago, and archaeologists haven't got to grips with that yet, except in this one study, then that opens up huge vistas of time in which extraordinary and interesting things could have happened in the Americas that archaeologists just haven't looked for. It was the case. It was the standard practice when Clovis first was the prevailing dogma, that there was no point in spending money or time digging down below the Clovis level.
Right.
There was no point in looking deeper. Just didn't make any sense to do that. Al Goodyear at Topper did look deeper. He did look deeper, and he found evidence that human beings had been there 50,000 years ago. Again, this is dismissed and ignored because it fights against a prevailing dogma. But sooner or later, it's going to be accepted.
And I speak about that quite a bit. I mean, stratigraphy is this idea of cultural layers. In most cases, barring some sort of mudslide, in almost all cases, the lower levels are going to be older than the higher levels.
Yeah, always.
And that's a basic
older
idea
is
in archaeology.
deeper.
Right.
And that actually inhibited research. The Clovis first model inhibited research into deeper levels. Money is scarce in archaeology.
And it's very hard, right? Because when you do archaeology, sometimes it's trenching, but most of the time you're doing 1 meter square areas, bigger than that, 1 meter square, and you're going down 10 centimeters at a time.
Yeah.
And especially if you're on a tight budget and it's expensive and time consuming, you're likely doing pointed archaeology towards finding a certain site. If you're looking for a historic period site from the 1800s, I've excavated some here in New England. You're not going to waste time going down lower, and they'll argue against this, but anyone who's done it knows that that's almost always true, that they're not going to look lower down.
Yeah.
Why would they? When if you're trying to learn about Paleo Indians from 2,000 years ago, you're trying to learn about historic period, either native or European American sites, there's no reason to go
And if you've
down.
taken on board a fixed view that the settlement of the Americas by human beings is relatively recent. The idea of going back 130,000 years and looking that far back and seeing what happened in the 130,000 years that have passed just seems pointless to many archaeologists.
And in certain cases, these things are only found because of private archaeology, because of CRM, cultural resource management. And in those cases, they're more likely to find these things because they have to survey an entire area. Maybe they're going down 30 feet.
Yeah, well, the Suruti Mastodon site's an example because a road was being built there. And Tom Desmarais and his team were called in to make sure no archaeology was being destroyed in the building of the road. And lo and behold, they found evidence of a vastly earlier human settlement of the Americas.
You got to find a new place for that road.
Yeah, but no, all the artifacts were removed and the road was built. They're all in the San Diego Natural History Museum now.
Well, that's good. That's good. Rarely is it that thorough.
One of them amongst many is a tusk that was stuck upright in the ground like a marker, and they have that on display in the Natural History Museum at San Diego exactly as it was found.
It's incredible. I don't know how I've never heard about this. I might do a thread on that, but that's
I wrote about it in America Before, which was published in 2019. I went to San Diego, I interviewed Tom Desmarais, I had a look at all the artifacts, and I'm convinced they're right.
I think I've read that.
As were the editors of Nature who published their paper and who have not retracted it.
Yes, of course. I don't think anybody can make Nature retract a paper. They'd have to be egregious.
Yeah.
I read that, so I must have forgotten about it. It's been a long time since 2019.
It's definitely worth having a look at. And we did not look at it in season 2 of Ancient Apocalypse, partly because we wanted to stick to subjects where archaeologists could not immediately go on the attack. And that's the case with the New Mexico finds. These attacks distract attention from the central issues that I'm trying to explore, and they are deliberately designed to do that. So as far as possible, we've tried to go for sites that it's really not very easy for archaeologists to attack us on, and to express the view that fundamentally what I'm talking about is very ancient ideas that constantly remanifest all around the world. And also another point to make here is that the date that a structure is actually built may not be all that there is to that structure.
Right.
And the key issue, the very simple example, I've given it before on a number of occasions, is the Gothic cathedrals in Europe, like Chartres Cathedral. These cathedrals were built in the 12th or 13th century AD of our era.
Right.
But they symbolize and manifest ideas going back to the time of Abraham, 4,000 years ago. So a structure can express ancient ideas without necessarily being ancient itself.
Right.
The whole astronomical plan of the Giza Plateau, the 3 great pyramids and their connection to the 3 stars of Orion's belt. And thank you to Robert Bauval for his Orion correlation theory, for which he was savaged by Egyptology, but which is an incredible genius discovery and a breakthrough. We know that what the site represents on the ground is the 3 stars of Orion's belt crossing the meridian on the spring equinox 12,500 years ago, as the stars looked at that time, because their position in the sky changes very, very slowly. At the same time, the Great Sphinx is looking at the constellation of Leo. And so you have due east, the constellation of Leo, with the Great Sphinx looking at it, due south, the three stars of Orion's belt, in exactly the pattern of the pyramids on the ground. Now, it would be possible to create that gigantic geoglyph, in a way, that's what it is, on the ground at Giza. You could create that in the Fourth Dynasty in order to memorialize a date that was incredibly important to you, just as the time of Abraham was incredibly important to the builders of the Gothic cathedrals in Europe. And I would be willing to accept that that's all it was, that here it's very important. Somehow the ancient Egyptians were using astronomy and megalithic architecture to memorialize a particular date that was very important to them, a date that they called Zep-Tepi, or the first time when the gods walked the earth. I could accept that this was a later work which was done to memorialize that earlier date. Even that would be rejected by Egyptologists if it were not for the geology of the Sphinx and the geology of those megalithic temples, which shows extensive erosion by rainfall. And you have to go back a long time, 12,000 plus years, to get that kind of erosion regime on the Giza Plateau. So I think the Giza Plateau is a complex mixture of structures partly built to memorialize an earlier date and structures that were actually built at that earlier date.
And that would fit in with how we see a lot of sites in the world.
Yeah.
Gosh, there's a number of things. I mean, the Orion, the orientation of those pyramids, at the very least, just the orientation, it matches pyramid complexes in Mexico as well as in China.
Yeah, there's a number of examples, and it's amazing in how many ancient cultures the constellation that we call Orion was very important. The ancient Egyptians called it Sahu, and they regarded the constellation of Orion as the celestial image of the deity Osiris. So one of the arguments that Egyptologists, archaeologists put forward against the Orion correlation is, you can match up any three stars to any three buildings if you want to, in one way or another. But these are not just any three stars. These are the belt of the god Osiris that we're looking at. This is the most important figure in ancient Egyptian spirituality. His celestial image seen on the sky. This whole notion of as above, so below, that one of the motives of the ancients was to bring down the perfection of the heavens upon the earth. There are even passages in the ancient Egyptian books of the dead which instruct the initiate to build upon the ground a copy of the sky.
Oh,
I've cited them in a number of previous books, and that's what I believe we're seeing at Giza. And we're seeing a project that unfolded over thousands of years. The ancient Egyptians were definitely deeply involved with it. They themselves had a very profound notion of the antiquity of their culture. There are records going back tens of thousands of years in ancient Egyptian king lists. It's curious that archaeologists take those king lists as gospel as far as the First Dynasty. But the lists that go back before that, tracking kings who were present 30,000 years ago or more, they say, they just made all that up. So again, it's this selective attention. The bits that support our idea we'll accept. The bits that don't support our idea we'll reject.
Right. So that's actually a perfect segue. I want to ask you about shamanism after this, but as far as selection, one of the things that I think I see a lot is almost a weaponization, I would say, in my opinion, of indigenous beliefs, as well as a rejection of indigenous beliefs if they are not helpful to the current narrative. For example, I mean, you can find the Lakota and the Hopi talking about extraterrestrial beings. They talk about them, and I'm not saying that means that's true. What I'm saying is, if you're going to accept evidence from certain indigenous peoples when it suits your narrative, I find it extraordinarily disrespectful and unconvincing if you don't take it at a whole.
If you cherry pick the evidence for bits that support your point of view, and unfortunately that's what happens. And again, it's a part of the politicization of archaeology. There are certain words and certain ideas that can be weaponized and used to attack alternative ideas, and that's certainly one of them. I think if we're going to have respect for indigenous traditions, we have to have respect for all of those traditions, not just for the ones that serve us.
Exactly. and not dismiss a number of other ones.
Yeah.
I hope you're enjoying this so far. Obviously, for me, this was a dream come true. And if you're new to the channel, subscribe and take a look at the channel where I have standalone videos, a lot of them checking the claims of Flynn Dibble, as well as a bi-weekly podcast where I interview people on topics relating to history and human culture, like Native Americans, proponents of alternative history, as well as academics from several different fields. If you want to support my work monetarily, you can sign up for my Patreon, where it's only $2 a month at the lowest tier, and you get early and unedited podcast episodes. I also recommend you check out our sponsor, Axios Fitness. Axios Fitness has been very useful to me. It provides me with a community of men, all of us interested in continuing to reach our fitness goals, and a personalized fitness plan that takes into account my own abilities, chronic injuries, and specific goals. At the link below, you can find 5 free fitness templates, and plans start at just $25 a month after an activation fee. The link for the Patreon and Axios Fitness are both below in the description.
So shamanism, animism. Have you ever spoken to a cultural anthropologist? I think there would be a lot of value in that.
I have spoken to a number. One of the issues that brought my attention to shamanism in the first place was the work of Professor David Lewis Williams, who is an anthropologist, oblique archaeologist at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. And he was one of the first mainstream academics to point out something that Terence McKenna had long ago realized with Food of the Gods, which is that the imagery seen in rock art and cave art is an imagery of visions, that those ancient artists were painting their visions, and they were having those visions in deeply altered states of consciousness. The key element of shamanism is an altered state of consciousness.
Right.
Shamans undertake their healing and their understanding of the world around them in a deeply altered state of consciousness. In the case of the San in Namibia, sometimes referred to as Bushmen, in the case of the San, that altered state of consciousness is not brought on by psychedelics. It's brought on by an exhausting dance that takes place for 24 hours or more, a trance dance, with no liquid to refresh the dancers. And eventually those dancers fall into a deep trance-like state. And in that, they're shamans. And in that trance-like state, their experience is that they leave their bodies and that they can ascend into the sky. And this is often used for practical purposes. Once they make that out-of-body journey, they will identify where herds of game are, that the rest of the team can go and hunt.
Yes.
It's used for healing very, very often. But what's fundamental to all shamanism is this altered state of consciousness. And around the world, the San are something of an exception. Around the world, that altered state of consciousness has been brought on by the use of medicines that we call psychedelics today, which are available in a huge range of plant species, and indeed some creatures like toads have psychedelic secretions. Shamanistic cultures have a very experimental approach to the natural world. When I've worked with shamans, particularly in the Amazon, what I've seen them doing is constantly sampling plants all around them and then adding them to mixtures that they've already made and see what's the effect of that. It may be a medicine for healing, or it may be ayahuasca, which does bring on a profound visionary state. But shamans again and again will add a pinch of this or a pinch of that to the ayahuasca brew. Let's see what this does. It's an experimental approach, but the net effect is a brew that is enormously powerful and leads to a deeply altered state of consciousness in which profound realizations can be made. And I think when I consider this elusive target that I call a lost civilization, that I've spent the last 30 years of my life trying to home in on, and it is a very elusive target, when I consider that, what I see is a culture that emerged out of shamanism, just like every other culture in the world, but a culture that maybe just went a bit further, took that shamanic interest in the skies, in the stars, and turned it into a real scientific astronomy. That were great navigators and seafarers. You need astronomy in order to navigate. I'm not saying that, and I've never proposed that this was a civilization that had, machine technology or steam engines or diesel engines for that matter, or cars or spaceships. No, I'm saying that it was a culture that emerged out of shamanism like every other culture, but went a bit further in a number of directions. And the evidence I rely on for that is the incredibly precise astronomy that we find in very ancient civilizations, going right back. It's there in Göbekli Tepe, and it was there during what is referred to as the Stone Age.
And that precision is undeniable.
It's undeniable.
Right.
It's incredibly precise, and built into it is a knowledge of this obscure phenomenon called the precession of the equinoxes. And I do need to explain that, because it's important for people to understand, as the ancients clearly did, that the Earth is our viewing platform from which we observe the stars. And the Earth is not still. The Earth, first of all, is in orbit around the sun. Secondly, the Earth is revolving on its own axis, about 1,000 miles an hour at the equator. And thirdly, there's a wobble on the axis of the Earth. And that wobble is called precession. It's like a spinning top, which is going into a slight decay of its spin. And instead of being upright, it goes at an angle, and it starts to do that. And the effect of that is that the extended north pole of the Earth points at different areas of space over a long period of time. This precessional cycle takes close to 26,000 years to complete. 1 degree every 72 years. The figure that is locked into ancient mythology all around the world is the number 72, and multiples of the number 72. To observe and understand this phenomenon, why it changes the rising positions and the orientations of certain stars. For example, if you look at the stars of Orion's belt as they appeared from Earth in 2500 BC, we have excellent computer software now that can model this. Their orientation is not exactly the same as the orientation of the 3 Great Pyramids on Giza. But if you precess the skies back to 12,500 years ago, you find that orientation gradually shifting. And 12,500 years ago, they lock to the pattern of the 3 Great Pyramids on the ground. So they understood precession, and they were using precession as a vehicle for memorializing particular dates. And that it's a highly sophisticated achievement. Right. And I don't come to that alone. I come to that knowledge first and foremost. It's really what started me on this quest, amongst many things. I've mentioned it before, and I'll mention it again. It's the book called Hamlet's Mill by Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Deschen. They were both professors of the history of science. Giorgio de Santillana was professor of the history of science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. No lightweight. Hertha von Deschen was professor of the history of science at the University of Frankfurt. No lightweight. They got together and created this incredibly hard to read book. I sometimes wonder if it was deliberately hard to read, because it's dynamite. It's a time bomb at the heart of the whole notion of the past that archaeology presents us with. Is a time bomb that shows that what they call some almost unbelievable ancestor culture had got to grips with the precise details of precession and understood how to use that and built it in to monuments all around the world and into mythologies. The same numbers, the number 72, which is 1 degree of precession, 2,160, which is 30 degrees of precession, 29,520, which is 360 degrees of precession. The cycle winds round and it all starts again. It's cyclical, then it comes back to the same point. We're pointing at Polaris right now, the extended north pole of the Earth. That's our pole star. It won't be for long. Eventually, the pole will move off Polaris. Sometimes it'll point at empty space. Sometimes it'll point at other stars. But after about 26,000 years, it'll be back pointing at Polaris again. Same with the constellations of the zodiac, which lie on what's called the ecliptic, the path of the sun. The wobble on the Earth's axis changes the time of year at which those stars rise holding the sun. And it's just a plain fact that the constellation that lay behind the sun 12,500 years ago was the constellation of Leo. The observed effects of precession, which is a wobble on the axis of the Earth, are multifold, but in 2 areas in particular, they're very clear. One is the changing of the pole star over that cycle of nearly 26,000 years, and the other is the changing of the constellation of the zodiac that lies behind the sun. In ancient language, it was called that housed the sun on the spring equinox. And right now, that constellation is Pisces. We live in the age of Pisces. And the song is right. We live in the dawning of the age of Aquarius. Precession is gradually going to shift the constellation that houses the sun away from Pisces and and into Aquarius. And that will happen within the next 150 years or so. So we do actually live in the dawning of the age of Aquarius.
I had a conversation with a brilliant young woman about my age, with what I mean by young, but who studies astrology like this, and she talked to me about this for an hour and a half. Completely blew my mind. I just wanted to.
See, archaeologists will sneer at that, and they'll just, it's just astrology. It's just astrology. No, it's not just astrology. It's the result of thousands of years of precise scientific observations by cultures that archaeology has not yet got to grips with, and that have passed down a legacy of that knowledge all around the world. That's what's going on.
And they'll use the exam. They'll dismiss astrology as what's being put in Us Weekly, rather than the incredibly in-depth, thousands of years study in multiple countries. I mean, the Mayans, the Chinese, the West as well.
No ancient culture, particularly a shamanistic culture that was observing the skies, could have missed the constellations of the zodiac, because they are the constellations that lie along the path of the sun.
They just call them different things.
There are many other constellations that don't lie on the ecliptic, but those 12 constellations do. That's what makes them so important from an observational point of view.
And that really, it gets into the different values that a society would have, and the idea of thinking that advanced has to necessarily mean this single trajectory for human civilization, where you have to have industrialization. In a lot of ways, it's the opposite of advanced. A civilization that's not sustaining, it's not sustainable, and not as yes, environmental sustainability, but sustainability in general. A civilization like ours that is doing things right now that cannot continue if we are to continue as a culture and as a species.
The notion that we represent the apex and the pinnacle of what advancement can be is just rubbish.
It's hubris on a generation.
It's a very, very, very bad idea. There's lots of different ways to be advanced in which our society is stunted and dwarf-like. Our society is not spiritually advanced, and yet spirituality is of fundamental importance in the experience of being human. Whether we reject it or whether we accept it, it's there, and it's played a huge role in all human cultures as far back as we can remember. In its present form, it manifests in big hierarchical organized religions. But in antiquity, it was very, very different. And particularly in shamanism, it's a close connection with what shamans regarded as the spirit world, which quantum physicists might define as parallel dimensions. This is, this is another area where I get myself into trouble. But the active ingredient of ayahuasca is DMT, it's dimethyltryptamine, very powerful psychedelic. Which most people in the West experience by smoking or vaping. In which case, which I've done numerous times, in which case it produces a very rapid journey to the other side of the universe, where you find yourself in a seamlessly convincing parallel realm, but it's so confusing and so fast that you're in there and out of there in 10 minutes. Nevertheless, studies of the reports of volunteers who are now being given DMT at Imperial College in London and at the University of California at San Diego.
Again, very non-prestigious trash universities.
In fact, the best universities are now seriously studying DMT, and not studying it only for its potential therapeutic effects. We already know that psilocybin has enormous therapeutic effects, that it can help people out of deep depressions, that it can help people with post-traumatic stress disorder. And I welcome the fact that medical science is now looking at the therapeutic potential of psychedelics, of all psychedelics, and beginning to open their arms to those medicines that were demonized for so long by so many different people. But in the case of DMT, the studies that are going on now are not primarily focused on the therapeutic effects. They're primarily focused on the fascinating fact that volunteers from all over the world are reporting entering the same realm and meeting the same entities who communicate with them in the same way. And normally when hundreds or thousands of people all around the world report the same experiences, we would accept those experiences as real. And the only barrier to accepting those experiences as real is that these experiences are being brought on by a substance. The way that DMT is being looked at now in the latest scientific studies is not so much as a substance, it's a technology. It's a technology for allowing access to realms that are normally closed off to us. And they may be parallel dimensions. We don't know what they are. But we know that shamans, going back to the origins of humanity, have embraced those realms and called them spirit worlds. What we will call them in the future, we don't know. The possibility remains open that it's just our brains on drugs, that our brains are making it all up. But my goodness, if our brains are making it all up, for this to happen all around the world with people who are not in contact with one another, meeting the same entities who do the same things
with different cultural understandings.
With different cultural understandings. I gave an example of this in my 2005 book, Supernatural, which has recently been retitled Visionary. In America, and it's pretty clear from the evidence that I went through that the entities that were called fairies or elves in the Middle Ages.
Right, fairies very important to Celtic culture.
Yeah. These little entities, which could be healing entities, but they could also be very nasty and do mean things to you. Right. Spirits, as shamans refer to them, and the entities that we call today aliens, they all have many characteristics in common that I come to the conclusion that they're all viewing the same phenomena through different cultural lenses. The cultural lens we're wearing inevitably affects how we interpret what we see.
Right.
And the latest way to interpret these strange beings that come to us in a visionary state is to interpret them as aliens. Now, I'm not saying that means that aliens are just creatures of our imagination. I'm suggesting that consciousness, proper studies of consciousness using these medicines may be a way to break through and to find much more out about consciousness. I'm not saying that there are no physical aliens. I'm sure that they are. But if we're going to get to grips with what we call the alien phenomenon today, what shamans called the phenomenon of spirits, what was called fairies and elves in the Middle Ages, we're going to have to study consciousness and the mystery of consciousness much more closely. And what's remarkable about these new studies is that's exactly what they're doing. They're using DMT to investigate the mystery of consciousness, and beyond that, the mystery of reality. What is reality, this thing that we call real? And again, that's why I do suggest that period of amnesia, when in my view we lost our connection with a former civilization that was advanced not in the ways that we are, but in many other ways, was a culture that used altered states of consciousness to gain access to knowledge.
Right.
And it's important to remember that scientists to this day still report gaining access to knowledge using psychedelics.
Right.
Classic example is
It's okay. It's okay. No worries.
The classic example is Kerry Mullis with the polymerase chain reaction. Kerry Mullis quite frankly stated that he got that on LSD. That's when the information came to him. And although it's more controversial, it's also true of Francis Crick, that he got the double helix character. He'd been working on not only him, but with a number of others as well. But when it finally coalesced in his mind as to what the DNA molecule was, the double helix structure, he was on LSD. So instead of demonizing these substances, we should see them as substances that can bring huge creative impulses to people. And those creative impulses, I think, were part of the lost civilization that I'm looking for.
And although it has gotten better, like you named several specific examples, our culture is very materialist, unfortunately. But there are...
It's very materialist, and this applies not only to the overvaluation of material goods and material things, and to the fact that we weigh and measure one another according to what we own or possess. This is one of the very negative aspects of our culture today. But it also infects science, where scientific materialism seeks to reduce everything to matter. That if it can't be weighed, measured, and counted, it doesn't exist. And science needs to be much more open than that in every way, and I'm glad that projects are now going on using DMT that are opening those doors.
Yes, I am as well.
Again, this is a matter I've touched on before, but I want to pay tribute to the shamanistic feats of science that led, in the first place, to the creation of the ayahuasca brew.
Right. Many thousands of years ago. We don't really know how long.
We don't know how long ago, but in my view, it's thousands and thousands of years in the past. The whole story of the ancient Amazon, which we tried to touch on in some depth in season 2 of Ancient Apocalypse, is a discovery that the Amazon is not what we thought it was, that it was a place that once housed millions of people, that it had cities, that it had huge roadways running through the Amazon, that those Amazonian populations were killed off by diseases that the Spanish brought in the conquest of Mexico. But up until the time the Spaniards were there, the Amazon was full of thriving metropolises.
Exactly.
And was creating a remarkable indigenous civilization, which traced its origins back to an earlier time. Many of the cultures and peoples of the Amazon have stories of how they arrived in the Amazon, how spirit beings played a part in their settlement of the Amazon and taught them what to do. At any rate, ayahuasca is a complicated mixture of fundamentally 2 different things, which is the ayahuasca vine, where the ingredients are primarily harmaline, and the leaves of a shrub called Psychotria viridis. It's known as chacruna in the Amazon. The leaves contain DMT, the vine contains harmaline. What happens is that the vine on its own will not give you a psychedelic experience. The leaves on their own will not give you a psychedelic experience, but when you cook them together, the power of DMT in the leaves is unleashed, because that harmaline in the vine shuts down an enzyme in the stomach that normally stops DMT being absorbed orally, which is why people in the West smoke DMT rather than trying to eat it.
Right. And you
can eat as much DMT as you like, and you will not have any journey.
Right.
But if you mix it with a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, which is precisely what is in the ayahuasca vine, then you will. So again, how this was done, there is another plant in the Amazon which also produces DMT that's used in the ayahuasca brew. Typically that brew is referred to as yahe. The ayahuasca brew uses chacruna, Psychotria viridis, as the DMT element. The yahe uses another vine called Diplopteris cabrirana. But to find those items in the Amazon rainforest, which are not active on their own, but are only work together in combination, is a huge scientific feat.
Right. It implies scientific experimentation to discover it.
Absolutely.
There's no other way you could get
There's no other way it could be done. And I think this goes very deep, very far back into human culture.
Right. And I think you're entirely correct. And I do think that there's something to be said about our own culture losing out on this. As a significant part.
Well, it's most unfortunate. Our own culture, and this was told to me by a shaman in the Amazon when I asked about the problems in the world. Mm-hmm. He said the problem with your culture is you've severed your connection with spirit.
Yes.
If you do not reconnect with spirit, I was given a lecture. If you do not reconnect with spirit, you're going to destroy the whole world. You're going to destroy yourselves, and you're going to destroy us as well.
Yes, there's nothing to argue about. I think that's entirely correct.
We have become disconnected from spirit, and yet spirit is a fundamental part of the human experience. It's like chopping off our left arms and suddenly saying, oh, that's okay.
And just to hammer in this point, it's not only early cultures. We're not just talking about like early Celts or San or the Amazon. I mean, the fortified wine that archaeobotanists have discovered, many examples of Romans using psychedelics in fortified wine.
Absolutely. My friend Brian Murarescu has written an excellent book that I wrote the foreword to called The Immortality Key, where he's looking at the use of psychedelic substances amongst the ancient Greeks and amongst the Romans. I touched on this in my book Visionary Supernatural as well back in 2005. The Eleusinian mysteries at the Temple of Eleusis, which is ruined now just outside Athens, involved a very complex initiation procedure where individuals who were carefully selected, who would go in there and who would not. Individuals, before they went into what was called the telestrion, these darkened halls under the temple, perfect setting for a psychedelic experience, were given a drink called the kaikion, and studies have shown that drink included barley, and that on that barley was a fungus related to ergot, which produced, which is fundamentally the basis of LSD. Mm-hmm. Effectively, they were drinking LSD in the Eleusinian temples, and we have some of the greatest minds of the ancient world. Plato, Sophocles, Socrates, all were participants in the Eleusinian mysteries, and they brought so much knowledge to the world. It's not an accident. That knowledge, I think, was revealed to them in visionary states. We despise visionary states today. We despise dreamers today.
Right.
And yet visionary states and dreams, again and again throughout history, have brought novelty and knowledge into the world. And so we're making a terrible mistake in doing that. I blame a lot of it on Richard Nixon and the war on drugs,
yes.
which is a fundamental abuse of human rights. Mm-hmm. Adults must be free to make decisions about what they put into their own bodies, so long as they do no harm to others.
Right.
And sending out the thought police to control our consciousness, to tell us what we may or may not experience in the inner sanctums of our own bodies, is a very dark step that's taken place.
Right.
And it's the propaganda behind it has been so powerful that many people just accept it without realizing that government is telling you what you may do with your own consciousness. That is a huge abuse of individual adult sovereignty.
Absolutely. And it's done purposefully. Even prior to Richard Nixon, there were policies against the use of drugs like this in order to help with the war effort, because it made people pacifists who would not join. And then later, apparently, marijuana made people violent, so they used that in the 60s and 70s.
All lies.
Right.
There's one drug that does make people violent, and that's alcohol.
Yes.
But alcohol is widely praised and lauded in our society.
Right.
It's advertised.
I would say Amanita muscaria as well is one that people should stay away from, which has some violent tendencies.
Yeah,
to
the
it,
Vikings used
Exactly.
that for the berserkers.
Right.
That is so. But the tryptamine psychedelics, of which DMT is one,
right,
do not produce violence. I'm not saying that we should regard these substances as totally harmless.
Exactly.
They can be harmful. There are people who should not take psychedelics. Anybody who is hearing voices anyway during their daily life, an early symptom of schizophrenia, they're likely to have their condition made worse by a big psychedelic journey.
Or even just marijuana
Or even just marijuana.
Right, if you have the possibility.
But I think what needs to be understood here is that what's happening is that these substances reveal an underlying condition.
Exactly.
They do not cause that condition.
Right.
Which is why the vast majority of people who smoke marijuana are completely harmless. And frankly, if I were to select a driver who, in one way or another, has either taken marijuana or has taken alcohol, I would choose the marijuana driver every time.
Exactly.
Because that driver is going to drive very slowly and very carefully, and it's not going to do anything rash or stupid. Yeah. Whereas alcohol makes us rash and do stupid, ill-judged things.
Exactly. Yes, alcohol is worse in every way.
And yet, it's the drug that is most available in our society today. Mm-hmm. Nobody gets sent to prison for drinking alcohol. Yeah. But you can get sent to prison for taking DMT. Yeah.
Or your actions on alcohol. Yes, and I think
the point of actions is very clear. This is, I think, an important point to make, is that we already have all the laws we need which deal with negative behavior towards others. Those laws already exist. We don't need that extra law which says, I'm sorry, we're the government and you cannot have this experience. Right. We don't need that law. That is Big Brother at work, injecting himself straight into our brains and controlling what we experience.
In a very literal way.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I fully agree. I think there's another drug that I wanted to bring up, which is even more ubiquitous, I think, than alcohol, and that's caffeine. Yeah. And caffeine is directly related to GDP. Caffeine consumption is directly related to GDP, mm-hmm. and I think that speaks a lot to how our culture views drugs. And then
do they serve the overwhelming desire of our culture for ever more production and consumption?
Exactly.
Or do they undermine that?
Right.
In some ways?
And when the West was becoming caffeine consumers in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they were coffee consumption, like coffee breaks came from factory owners pushing caffeine because it helps their production.
Sure. Yeah.
And we have this.
There was a time when I did enjoy a cup of coffee myself. But I've found as I've got older that I can't drink caffeine anymore. I never drank a lot of coffee, but maybe a couple of cups a day. Now I can't even drink one. Instant migraine.
Okay.
So I stay away from caffeine for that reason.
Okay. I love it. Actually, I love caffeine.
I loved it when I was your age.
Nicotine. Yeah. Okay. Maybe eventually I won't like it anymore.
Yeah.
What also worries me. All the drugs. I've written about this. I've done some work on when I say drugs in general, I mean all the ones we're talking about, caffeine as well as all the way up to the really serious stuff. Our culture has this obsession with hyper processing it. Mm-hmm. There's nobody smokes opium. There used to be, and there still is. Heroin or
now it's just OxyContin,
and even worse, fentanyl.
And
right?
fentanyl, far worse.
Right.
Far worse.
And
on these drugs, medicines, which have come to us, fentanyl is entirely artificial, as far as I know, but opium certainly is not. These medicines do have a role, and they have a role in the management of pain. If people are in severe pain from a growing metastasizing cancer, there is a place for morphine, which is a derivative of heroin. There is definitely a place for it. The problem is that's I would almost say that's what nature intended these medicines to be available for human beings to manage pain. If they're used for any other purpose, they rapidly lead to very destructive consequences,
right.
and addiction, which means that the person is losing agency over their own life,
yes.
which can't be a good thing. So there needs to be some careful thought around all these substances. Nevertheless, I believe they would be better managed in our society if everything was legal, but regulated.
Mm-hmm.
If first of all, kids need to be kept away from these things.
100%.
And they're not for children; they're for adults. Just like many other pursuits are adult only. I believe that's the case with psychedelics. People who've reached a stage of maturity where they can take responsibility for their own lives. The misuse of drugs largely arises from the fact that they are illegal, in my view, which creates a street market, right. where very inferior product, often cut with dangerous substances, is being sold to people. That can't be. It can't be good, and it's not going to work in the long run.
Yes, I fully agree, and we're seeing that pretty. I don't need to even say that. People know. Everybody has a personal experience themselves or with somebody that has a problem with these. So we're at an hour. We're at about an hour 30.
Okay, well, we're good. But
I just don't. I want to be respectful of your time.
Thank you.
Go
ask whatever else you want.
I want to ask you about season 2. I want to ask you about Rapa Nui. What am I missing here? Oh, do you think, on the subject of drugs, do you think that people, and I don't know how much archaeologists or academics are, I'm sure some of them are using psychedelics.
Sure, some are.
But do you think that somebody who has not had one of these experiences is missing out on something innate in the human experience?
Yeah, I think in the case of archaeology in particular, it's clear that plants, medicines that bring on deeply altered states of consciousness were fundamental to ancient cultures all around the world, as far back as we can go. And if, as an archaeologist, you're in the business of trying to understand ancient cultures, then I would say it's almost an obligation to have psychedelic experiences. Then you might get to grips with some of the stuff that you might otherwise regard as completely weird from ancient cultures. I think it's a duty beholden upon archaeologists to have psychedelic experiences, and I would take it further and say it's beholden on politicians as well.
Right, I've heard you talk about that before.
Yeah. It's really important because these medicines can completely reset our outlook on the world. Mm-hmm. And that's precisely why they're useful. That's precisely why they get people out of deep depression. A single, very heroic dose of psilocybin has been shown to get rid of a long-term depression virtually overnight.
Right.
That's because it resets everything. And you have an opportunity to step back and look at what you've been doing and what you're involved in, and you feel completely different about it. That can be beneficial to everybody, but under responsible, caring conditions.
And that's very important.
It's very important that if first of all, that children should not have access to these medicines, and secondly, that the medicines, in my view, are better taken in a ceremony rather than just taken individually.
And that's the way they were used in all of these cultures.
Are better taken in a ceremony, and that ceremony there should be an individual who is highly experienced with the effects of the medicine, so that if somebody is in trouble, that person can be helped very quickly. And that's what shamans do in ayahuasca sessions in Peru. Sometimes people freak out during an ayahuasca session. The role of the shaman, the shamans see that as bad spirits entering, and their role is to keep them at bay and to calm that person and help that person.
Right.
That's what we need. This is one of the areas, and it's one of many areas where we in the West, in the industrial technological world that we live in, we need to sit down humbly at the feet of shamans from hunter-forager cultures, particularly those in the Amazon, but other cultures as well around the world, and learn from them. We need to learn from them. They have more to teach us than we have to teach them.
Yes, I fully agree. I really do. Wow, awesome. So, season 2. A quick question and then my final one. So, I've heard you talk about the idea of capitals, right? And Rapa Nui is on the edge. Rapa Nui, Easter Island. Yeah. That's on the edge of Polynesian land, essentially. It's on the edge. It's almost all the way to South America.
Yeah.
What do you think about the idea that Rapa Nui was perhaps, and it's hard to prove this, especially with what we know now, but a pilgrimage site for people?
Oh, I think it's a very good idea because Rapa Nui, which most people these days call Easter Island, but the inhabitants called it Rapa Nui.
Yeah, I always go with the indigenous name.
Yeah,
just based on what I do. Yeah,
Rapa Nui is what we should refer to it as. Is within its own culture known as a navel of the world. A navel of the earth.
Right, navel, like the hands.
Yeah, like the hands of the statues pointing to the navel. And the interesting thing is that there are multiple other navels of the world all around the globe. Angkor in Cambodia is a navel of the earth. Delphi in Greece was a navel of the earth. Göbekli Tepe means the hill of the navel.
Oh.
That's what it means.
Okay.
It means the hill of the navel. Göbekli Tepe is another navel of the earth. And again, statues with the hands held over the navel in that way. Cuzco in Peru. Cuzco means navel of the earth. This is the same idea spread around. I think these were sites that were sacred, going back into deep antiquity. And I'm taking a bit of a reach here, but I think that they were part of a global geodetic project where lines of longitude were being laid out all around the world. So I don't think it's an accident that Angkor in Cambodia is 72 degrees of longitude east of Giza. The Giza Plateau was another navel of the world, specifically the neighboring city of Heliopolis, a navel of the earth. I think that Giza may have been the ancient prime meridian. And you will find that many other sites around the world that were called navels are at significant numbers of degrees of longitude separated from those. I think we're looking at the skeletal remains of a very sophisticated worldwide system of measuring and understanding the Earth. Wow. That's actually what geometry means, is Earth measuring.
Right. Wow. Okay, that was a lot more of an in-depth answer than I was expecting.
And Rapa Nui is one of those navels.
Wow.
That's the meaning of the place in the ancient language of Rapa Nui. It's not the meaning of Rapa Nui, but it is called a navel of the earth.
Wow. Okay, that's incredible.
The name Rapa Nui itself has complicated origin. Easter Island was called Easter Island because it was discovered on Easter Sunday by some, I forget the name of the Western sailor who so-called discovered it.
It was Cook, wasn't it?
Cook, I think. Yeah. I actually don't remember. But Easter Island went through a horrific experience of contact with Western culture.
Yes, it did.
Where almost the entire population was removed from Easter Island and taken away and enslaved.
Yeah.
In fact, by Peruvian slavers. And
Right.
those slaves were carried off to many other Polynesian islands. And one of those islands was thought to resemble, called Rapa Nui, was thought to resemble Easter Island.
Oh.
And so that's how it got the name.
Wow, that's unfortunate.
The name itself is relatively recent, but the ancient name is Navel of the Earth.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, that makes me feel differently about using the name Rapa Nui, as if I'm respecting the indigenous people there.
Te Pito o Te Henua is the meaning Navel of the Earth in the Rapa Nui language.
Incredible. I really wish we could decipher that script. Maybe someday.
The other name is Eyes Looking at Heaven, Mata Kitarani. These are the two ancient names of Easter Island.
Well, they're incredible names. I love how language, it is often when I say language, I mean specific, like the forms of it is a reflection of the culture that's created it, that lives there.
Yeah.
It's very common. Okay, so
It's been a great privilege to revisit Easter Island. My wife Santha and I first went to Easter Island, Rapa Nui, Te Pito o Te Henua, the Navel of the Earth. We first went there in 1992, and we've been back maybe 5 times.
It's a hard place to get to go there.
It's a long journey. It's 2,000 miles from the coast of Peru, 2,000 miles from Tahiti. I mean, you can't find a more remote spot on the face of the earth.
Right. To imagine they found it with dugout or outrigger canoes is incredible.
Yes. Yeah. It's an amazing achievement, but it's a magical place to be. It's an enchanted realm. I would urge anybody who has the opportunity to go to Rapa Nui, go there. It's a place that we should all visit once in a lifetime if we're able to do so.
And I plan to.
Good.
I will. I'd love to. Okay, so last question. I'd love to talk to you forever, but that's not realistic. As far as season 2 for Ancient Apocalypse, which everybody should watch, I'm going to drop something in to promote it even more, although my reach is quite a bit smaller than yours.
I appreciate the support, and I appreciate the support of the viewers of my shows, and I very much appreciate the support also of the readers of my books. I couldn't do anything without my readers and my viewers. I owe them everything. It's my readers and my viewers who've given me the freedom to undertake the research against the grain that I now do undertake. If it weren't for the support of readers and viewers, I couldn't do any of that.
Right. And so, if you're mad about the way that Graham and the rest of us are being treated, the best way to support him is by going on and watching Ancient Apocalypse if you haven't already, and rating it as well. That does help in
you bet it helps,
the algorithm.
Yeah.
So please do that. And also, it's an incredible series. What is your favorite or most compelling evidence that's from season 2? And you can take that question however you want.
The most compelling evidence that I try to bring to the attention of viewers is the worldwide spiritual system that is manifested in many, many different cultures, and that is not there as a result of coincidence, but that I'm convinced is the result of a legacy from a remote common source. And that is precisely what I was talking about earlier. After death, the soul is believed to leap to the heavens, to the constellation of Orion, to cross to the Milky Way, and to there confront challenges and to be questioned upon the life that individual has led. That idea is too complicated to have arisen by chance in multiple different cultures around the world, whether it's ancient India, whether it's ancient Egypt, whether it's Moundville in Alabama, or whether it's Rapa Nui, whether it's the Amazon rainforest, where the same idea is found amongst remote tribes that have had almost no contact with the outside world. They're still manifesting that same idea. We are looking at a legacy here. That's, to my mind, the most compelling evidence that exists, that this worldwide spiritual system did not arise by chance or by coincidence. What it speaks to is a legacy passed down from a remote common ancestor, a legacy in which we all share.
Fantastic. Graham Hancock, thank you so much for coming. Thank you for allowing me to interview you.
Thank you.
It means the world. It really does.
It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Yes. Thanks.
Cheers.